How you doing? Okay, it's time to talk about chapter 5. Talking about chapter 5. It's a great chapter on characters who, as we discussed back when we were talking about Aristotle and the Poetics, they're the ones who make the action of the play happen through their wants. And I started out in the business as an actor, and so was always just in love with making characters, getting into their skin. So let's see what they talk about. So on page 65, they mention what they said in chapter 1, which is that we need to think of analyzing plays as looking at what characters say, as doing, as verbs. That is part of how they get what they want. It's part of their tactic, which they talk about a little bit later in the chapter. Okay, so that's how, it's one of the ways that we figure out who these characters are. So on the bottom of page 5, they talk about identifying existing connections between characters. Are they social relationships, work, religious, family? What are those relationships like? And what do those relationships, this is me now, mean to those different characters, right? Some people are really close to their families, some people are not. So just because someone has a religious connection, it doesn't mean one thing, right? So we delve in really deeply. Okay. Regarding thinking about speech as a way to get what we want, I think that a lot of us have been cornered at one point in our lives, or sometimes frequently, by people who will monologue to us, right? And they're really not talking about very much, or they're not talking about anything they think we might find interesting. They find it interesting, but that is still talking to get what they want, right? People who do that often feel like they don't get enough attention or love, or they have some unfulfilled need, and they get attention from other people by monologuing to them, right? So even in real life, we talk or don't talk, which is also a choice and also an action to get what we want and to build relationships with other people or weaken relationships with other people. Okay, so they talk about mapping them, so pay attention to that, and I urge you to try that out, making a character map with Glass Menagerie. There are 4 characters, and one of them is only in one little section of the play, so your map is not going to be all that tricky. And they want you to talk about the quality of those relationships. Okay, I've got all kinds of notes around here. Oh, and there's an example of a character map on page 127 if you want to reference that now while we're talking about it. So on page 67, there's a section that is about responses to given circumstances. And you know how this is in real life, right? So there might be some young people around your age, maybe their parents get divorced. Maybe one of the kids of these parents is incredibly upset and really resentful, particularly at one parent or another, and they'll blame them for messing the whole thing up. Another kid might say, I'm so glad they're getting divorced because they just fought all the time and the household was full of yelling and that was really terrible. So the different characters of these different people will have different responses to given circumstances. So that's a real life example of the kind of thing that we look for in plays. They talk about simple versus complex behavior. Most characters are kind of complex, but sometimes we play very broad stereotypes of characters. But there are people in real life who will also stereotype themselves. Some people cling to a kind of superficiality or artificiality. Very often you can see people who like really play their gender strongly. Sometimes I teach classes at the FRC on campus, and there are what I think of as like gym bros, and they just want to be really big, and they walk around like looking big, and they might be very complex people, but in that visual way they're trying to seem a little more simple, right? Because they're very concerned with like what they look like and how muscly they are. Characters are tactical. So we talked about characters have wants, they have tactics to get them, like with that brief Mama, I want ice cream conversation that I mentioned from a previous lecture. Excuse me, I'm having allergies. Hang on. Okay. And characters have points of view. So just like how you yourself have a subjective point of view, when you are evaluating plays, you want to ask yourself, what is the subjective point of view of each of these characters? And that's one of the cool things about theater, is that when we make theater or evaluate theater, we get to try on other people's subjective lenses, which helps us better identify our own. So that's a cool thing, and you can embrace that with this chapter. Okay. Pay attention to the stage directions, because sometimes they tell us about character. We read for conflict, to heighten conflict, goals and tactics, blah, blah, blah. We talked about that. Oh, yeah. Going deep with relationships also goes with researching a period. Glass Menagerie is an interesting play because sometimes you see versions of it where Amanda, the mother, is just a harpy or just a pain in the butt. But because I'm a fan of history and I like reading, about history and especially women's place in it, I know that she didn't have any power in society back then. She seems really smart and she's interested in these medical things, and it makes me wonder if maybe she would have been a doctor if she could have been, or a physician's assistant, or I don't know, maybe in her youth, an emergency medical technician, or someone who went into, like, what do they call it? Medical administration or something like that. But none of those jobs was open to her as a woman during this time. Women who struggled mightily and maybe didn't have to support themselves in these roles could do it. So, for instance, I looked up the amount of women who are practicing lawyers in America in 1930, and it was 2.1% of lawyers. So 98 out of every 100 lawyers were men, and then 2 were women. Very interesting. So, anyway, Amanda in this play, she doesn't have a lot of options to earn money because she wasn't raised to think that she was supposed to do that, and the society isn't set up to welcome her to do that either. So that's part of why she puts all that pressure on Tom to succeed at his job, to stay at his job. Otherwise, what's going to happen to them? Which is one of the questions at the end of the show. Okay, so look at stage directions as character information. And again, we take stage directions on a case-by-case basis. You don't have to use all of them. But a lot of them you are going to wind up using if you stage a play, and they tell us a lot about the play. And language informs us about character, right? You might give a similar lecture someday to the one that I'm giving. Maybe you're going to go and get a terminal degree in theater and have a teaching position. And the way you cover this information to your students is going to be really different because you're a different person. So keep that in mind. Also, there's something on 71, dialogue suggests characters' physical actions. And this is from Romeo and Juliet, and it's kind of built into it that they're smooching. But it's Shakespeare, and it takes a really deep reading. So on a first reading, you, as a person who's not acquainted with Shakespeare, might not be able to tell that that's what's supposed to happen. Sometimes there's a line like, "Why did you hit me?" And then one of the characters was supposed to hit the other one. So look for that, anything in the dialogue that requires a physical activity from another character. They're talking about conflict again. Look for the conflict. And they ask, what goals and tactics do opposing characters pursue? We're looking for where these goals and tactics clash with each other. And through your answering of all of the questions that I'm asking you to answer and that I look forward to reading, you're starting to think in that direction, finding the conflict and understanding characters in relationship to conflict. You understand the characters' functions in the play and their tactics. And that's what I got. All right, see you in the next chapter. Email me with questions.